Sales of iPhone dropping 12%, now comprising less than 50% of overall revenues. Good thing or bad?
Today where the stock is, I would say, it's not a bad thing. A year ago, it would have been a terrible thing. Obviously, having better iPhone sales is always good. But the longer term you look at it, this is a company that's going through a transition. iPhone was the story for the last 10 years. I think the next 10 years is going to be about services. But those transitions do take time. It's not going to happen overnight. But I think we are slowly progressing to that, where you're exiting a mature hardware market to a more growth-focused, high multiple-driven services unit business.
So, Amit, is that headline right to say that Apple is not an iPhone company anymore?
I mean, it's 52% right, correct, at this point at least. Listen, iPhone units at the end of the day is what's going to drive the story, right? If the install base starts declining, iPhone units is a leading indicator. So I wouldn't quite ignore iPhone units ever. But I do think it's notable that despite 12% revenue declines in iPhones, overall revenues grew. So the story is shifting, I would say, from monetization of the iOS space versus just the iPhone units the way it's always been.
And I mean, we were just talking about this last hour. It is still the iPhone company, because as you were saying, iPhone drives services more than anything else. To me, the bright light in this quarter was the realization that this other stuff, the margins on it and the growth in that, if Apple's able to get people to take on multiple services and multiple wearables, that could make up for the drop in iPhone. And I wonder if you think we have enough data to really gauge how that's going over the next 4 quarters.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I do think, there's two parts of it, right? On the services side, compares actually get really easy for Apple for the next 4 quarters if you think about all the China bans that were there last year. So that, along with all the new product stuff that Josh was talking about, should help drive acceleration there. And then on the other side, you have wearables, right? I mean, we all keep losing more AirPods every 6 months than we should, and Apple Watches are doing fairly well. So I do think it's more about wearables and services getting an easier compare as you go forward.
Krish, what does Apple need to do with this next iPhone lineup? Since what this quarter's earnings showed me was that price sensitivity really was an issue, particularly in China, because we saw the VAT reduction having an impact there, plus financing, plus trade-ins. All of those are price-related. So where does Apple need to price this next lineup in order to keep that goodness going?
It's a great question. The one thing I would say is that, that has been the biggest challenge last year, where it was very obvious that once you crossed a $1,000 price point, the consumers are very sensitive to it. The other thing is, the expectation is for a 5G iPhone coming out later next year. And therefore, for what you might see is the iPhone cycle this year is a little bit artificially depressed, with consumers holding out for the next iPhone. To your point on the VAT reductions, I think the one other thing worth noting is that even though overall, over the last several quarters, Apple's iPhone share in China has been coming down, I think they're trying to increase it in India. And one way of doing it is also having local manufacturing there, with Foxconn having a plant in India. One of the upsides to that is you don't have to pay some of the duties that you have to pay if you're importing it from outside and into India, which actually helps, or I should say, which adds to the pricing of the iPhone. So net-net, I think what you're going to see is a transition of overall, over the next 4 quarters, more India, less China. But the big run-up is going to be later next year when the 5G phone comes out.
Yeah, to that point, Amit, some have argued that the stock historically starts to price in the new phone about 9 months ahead of the launch. Is there any reason to think this cycle would be different, either because of 5G or because of global trade, anything like that?
I would tell you, I think the 5G narrative is going to be powerful. And my gut is, people are going to start debating the duration. If you're negative on this name, it's about 2 quarters. But if you're bullish, you probably need to start being engaged with the 5G cycle sometime in early 2020. So I do think that's going to be the overriding factor. China, to your point, depending on what tweet you get, could have ramifications on Apple. It's a bit less of an issue these days, but it's the other one I would worry about over here.
Krish, I want to dig into services a little bit more. I realize Apple's going to be launching some new platforms this fall. But how much of that services growth hinges on the App Store? And I ask that because you have that lawsuit that's moving forward. You also have this antitrust scrutiny more broadly, both here in the U.S. and Europe, where the App Store is concerned.
No, absolutely. And I think the TV Plus and the arcade launching, to me, is going to be really closely watched for two reasons. Number one is that the pricing is going to really determine the consumer interest. You already have Disney Plus at $6.99 a month, which has kind of set the bar. So I guess realistically, it's going to see like how Apple can price this. The second one I'd also argue is that one thing to look into like longer term is once Apple starts creating original content, which they need to do in order to acquire more consumers or customers, that's going to start flowing through the COGS line of the P&L. So what you're going to see is potentially the gross margin as a percentage might come down, but the gross profit dollars might increase as the revenue for services increases. So I think those are two things to keep in mind, but I do think the pricing of the TV Plus and arcade is going to be very critical. That would actually determine if you're going to be still tethered to your hardware install base, or you're going to start getting more new consumers or customers that are not currently like Apple users.